My name is Philip Martin, and I am the co-owner of Philip Martin Gallery with Portia Hine. And I hope that you've had a chance to meet Portia either at the fairs or at the gallery. You're welcome to come anytime. And if you have any questions about any of the works that you're looking at, of course, just feel free to send us an email. I am delighted to be speaking today with Sky Glabush on the occasion of Mount Temptation, for also the title of this piece, which is a little exhibition that we've put together online, focusing on works on paper and just talking about those today. How are you doing, Sky? How are things going?
I'm doing great. Yeah, things are
Thanks so
going good.
much. Thanks so much for joining us. So maybe we want to just kind of get right into it. This is a piece called Mount Temptation that I saw in your studio this summer. Do you want to talk just a little bit about, where do you want to get started?
Yeah, that image is from a postcard, and that that's an actual place, I guess, in um, I guess you could say that's in Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's the place where supposedly Jesus was that was tempted by the devil or something for 3 days or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And yeah, I didn't know any of that at the time. I just thought it was an interesting picture of a mountain, but then it turns out it's a specific site in Palestine where yeah, there was this encounter with the devil.
And so how
But
did this work come
yeah,
about in terms of working from photographs? Because I don't believe you and I have ever really talked about that aspect of your practice so much.
yeah, I mean, sometimes I work from photos that I take. Sometimes I work directly on site, like when I was in Switzerland, I did a few paintings right up on the mountain, um, or the mountains. I was in the Alps, and so sometimes I work plein air, sometimes I work from photos, sometimes I work directly from my imagination.
Mm-hmm.
But I like to go. There's a really interesting bookstore and that I go to where they have a lot of old vintage postcards, and I'll just sort of pilfer through images, and they're like $1 or something like that. And I'll often buy like a whole bunch at a time. So that initial mountain photo was just from a postcard that I found. And then what I'll often do is make a drawing of the postcard or some kind of ink on paper, and then kind of make a watercolor from that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah.
And so do you find that you get different kind of information from these different sources, or provokes different mark making or pictorial moves? How does that work?
Yeah, like sometimes I'll sit down in the studio, I'll sit down with a number of works on the go, like maybe 10 or 15, like I think we talked about this before,
Yep.
but like maybe 10 or 15 works on paper where they're all at various stages, and I'll work really quickly on and as soon as I get an idea of where it's going, I'll leave it, and I'll start a new one or move to a new one, and I kind of just shuffle my way through the deck in terms of the works that are grabbing my attention. And so sometimes that's very improvisational, and I'm just working from memory, or literally just spilling paint and stuff. And other times I'm working directly with an image and trying to figure it out. There isn't really any rhyme or reason in terms of how I go about finding an image. Um, it's always just a place to start, and then and usually it has to get abandoned relatively quickly.
Yeah.
um, so usually what I do is if I'm working from an image like a photograph or something like that, I get the thing up to the place where I feel like it's captured sort of the
Right.
general characteristics of that, that place or that person or that thing. And then and then I leave the image behind, and I start just allowing some of the forms to kind of dominate, and some of the I just basically try to find what the thing could be about, because I
Mm-hmm.
don't always know, like, where's this headed? What's it going to be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this piece is interesting. It's sort of a new motif, possibly a rain motif.
Yeah, not new. I've done this a lot in the past. I've avoided doing it for a while because it always looks good when you cover a painting and a screen of dots. It always sort of resolves it magically. So I was avoiding doing that in a way. But I also really wanted. There was a few paintings I had been looking at by Hokusai and Van
Mhm,
Gogh and a few others that where they were some kind of screen of rain or snow or sleet in front of the image.
mhm,
And so I was trying to think about another way, or not another way, but I was trying to think of a way to explore that. And this one, I also was kind of inspired by thread, like a kind of an embroidery technique
mhm,
that I've seen on certain fabrics,
mhm,
um, and a way of kind of making almost like a making a color through an ambient kind of screen. So
mhm,
you get this sort of muted kind of color that I'd seen in textiles.
mhm.
But yeah, this is just it was a simple a little experiment and a playful thing about um, using a kind of phenomenon like rain to activate the surface and to in a sense to flatten things out, but also to kind of um, allow for this kind of ambience or this kind of overall quality.
Well, the feeling of a screen is really also effective in that it locates the viewer. One thing that I was thinking about is that whereas other artists might depict people in a landscape, so it's almost like watching a movie. You see you're watching other people do stuff. In your work, you're able to place the viewer in the place of the experiencer, so to speak, by some kind of relationship to your own experience.
Yeah, no, it's a it's an important observation, and it's something that I struggle with and think about a lot is the relationship between um, like who's looking,
Mhm.
who's the viewer, because you know as the painter or the artist, you're kind of the viewer, but you also know that it's going to go out for the most part, and you're not going to be the viewer. You're actually going to be I mean, anybody that's standing in front of it is going to be
Mhm.
in that position.
Right.
So sometimes I've experimented with putting figures in the work or having the subject be another person or whatever, which I play with quite a bit. But for example, with the painting that you have up in front of you, there's two ways of looking at it. One is I kind of think of the elements in the painting as kind of the figurative element in the sense that
Mhm.
they almost become like they have the energy or they have the kind of qualities of another thing or like
Mhm.
another person or another element that's active and alive. It's not just viewer and subject. It's actually the subject itself has a kind of presence or a kind of personality, almost a figurative quality. Um, and then in some of the paintings it's really clear that there's a viewer and something being viewed,
Mhm.
like the space between the between you and the subject is there's a distance there that I'm trying to maintain.
Mhm.
um, but yeah, that quality of placing yourself within the image as the person experiencing it
Mhm.
that is an important aspect of what I try to explore, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think it connects your work to abstraction. And someone like, say, I mean, I'm just saying Rothko, for example. Um, that feeling that, yeah, I don't, in terms of, or Terry Winters is another person that I often think of in relationship to your work, or Lee Mulligan. Um, this feeling where the artist is kind of both the creator and moves from the creation process through being through when you reach a final resolution, the artist is kind of the first viewer of. And so it's that process of getting to that place that then enables for all time moving forward the viewer to be able to be in that place. I'm not articulating this very well. I don't know if you respond to that, but an idea in my
No,
mind.
I think you are. I think that's exactly it. I think the moment when something kind of snaps into being, like
Mhm.
it's interesting when you're making paintings, because they're really inert and they're
Mhm.
very dead things for the most part. Like they don't start, when I, at least for me, they don't start off having really any convincing. They're just really fake things
Mhm.
in a way. Like they're very contrived and they're very illusory
Yeah.
and but then at some point there's a moment, sometimes you're
Mhm.
hoping for it anyway, there's a moment when they go from being an illusion or just colors and marks into being, they kind of, something enters
Mhm.
and they feel kind of real, like they feel like they're an actual, um, they have a kind of a presence, they have a kind of a reality. So
Mhm.
that moment, if you're kind of playing and experimenting and moving things forward and moving things backwards and changing things and waiting for something to happen, and then when it happens, you're right. If you can kind of be the observer, at the same time as the person sort of making the decisions, but if in a sense you're almost allowing the painting to start almost making its own decisions in a way,
Yeah.
um, the viewer, I think, can sense that, and I know from experience that, when I used to paint in a very non-objective, very abstract way, it was exactly the same thing. It's just
Mhm.
now, um, there's also a kind of, okay, there's two things going on. One is you're waiting, or you're moving, or you're setting up a condition where the painting can feel real,
Yeah.
but I'm also dealing with the problem of it feeling real, like it's got energy, but also feeling real, like it's a convincing space.
Yes.
So the two things are at play.
Yeah, totally.
It's not just real as a formal composition, but it's also the space or the light or
Mhm.
the qualities of the image also
Mhm.
feel kind of like not convincing as like a photograph or convincing as an image,
Right.
but the, what's up and what's down and what's back and what's forward
Mhm.
and what's left and what's right, those things also feel kind of like not believable, but they're adding to that quality. They're
Yeah.
adding to that sense of it having a kind of energy or kind of a reality.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of an interesting, tough moment that I think is part of getting into, or can be part of getting, or maybe respond to the getting into some notion of how one as an individual is both a maker, and then you're in this communication with another individual as a viewer. Meaning that, if you're painting a still life, um, there, or maybe working from photos, there's this question of like, well, what is the thing that I'm painting? What is my responsibility to that, so to speak? What is my responsibility to the photo in terms of that? And photos can be very tricky because they're such a loaded amount of information, but totally non-normal human experiences, although of course they're becoming that way as we move into whatever our beings are. And then there's this question that I used, inadvertently, this word I used inadvertently, which is responsibility. And it's this shift of realizing that rather than having this responsibility to what you're doing, your responsibility in a certain sense is being able to make those choices that enable the viewer to see the painting. And then that's kind of intriguing because then you're like, well, actually, to make this space work, even though these leaves are there, that would be incomprehensible to somebody. And so I actually need to move those out of the way. I need to move the leaves that are actually there out. I need to remove them, say, to actually give them the experience of leafness in this other lived way. Again, I don't know if you respond any of that, but I don't know.
No, I mean, I think the challenge that you're having is the challenge that we all have. It's
Yeah,
hard to speak about. It's hard to articulate some of these things in words. Actually, it really is. And I
yeah.
kind of make a living talking about art in a lot of ways. So it's like it's frustrating that after so many years, it remains, language still is so cumbersome and awkward.
Yeah.
But but I think what you're grappling with is sincerely the core problem, and what it is for me is if I take an artist like Mark Rothko or
Mhm.
Clifford Still, for example,
Wow.
who I've always really loved, and I remain deeply affectionate to, like I have a deep affection for that work. Anyway, with a painting like, for example, by Clifford Still, one of these large, expansive abstract paintings, you have motion, you have energy, you have light, you have tension, but the resolution is a completely individuated, completely unique visual language. And it's
Mhm.
one of pure, in a sense, pure abstraction.
Yeah.
And in my case, I'm looking for something very, very similar and akin to that,
Mhm.
except the language is not a pure individuated language. It's a shared familiar language
Yeah.
that
Mhm.
any 4-year-old would understand.
Yeah,
And
totally.
that's in a sense, that's the only difference, is that when those shapes or those moves come together, they also come together in a way that's very recognizable. And
Yeah,
and it's not that I give a crap about it being recognizable. It's
totally.
that the language itself is a communal language.
Yeah. Hmm. It's interesting as you say that, because I think then it leads you to this question that's hard for me to understand, which is why people get, no, not hard for me to understand, but I think we're hammered into the idea that abstraction and representation are different somehow. Um, when the mind is grappling with these things, they're different. They are different pictorial systems, and I suppose you can largely group them as separate. But in terms of how things function, in terms of pictorial construction and one's view, the experience, the full being experience of something, I mean, they're totally related.
Yeah, I mean that's what I'm grappling with. And
Mhm.
I don't I personally don't actually feel that there is much of a difference between
No.
abstraction and figuration. As I was mentioning just before the talk, I'm here in Chicago, and I'm looking at this George O'Keeffe show, which is
Mhm.
really a very amazing exhibition,
Yeah.
and she really makes the case that there isn't a big distinction between abstraction and figuration, and that was
Mhm.
a long time ago, like that's in the 20s and whatnot. And it's just like 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So, um, and I agree, but I do think there is a different kind of freedom in, say, Clifford Still, in
Yeah.
a lot, being able to really just sort of completely invent your own pictorial or visual language. I think there's a freedom there
Yeah.
that I envy and that I want and I need, and it's very important. But I also, for me, there's also not so much a freedom, but there's also a kind of a value in making something that any person could walk in and
Totally.
understand
Yeah.
the language you're using. And it's sort of like then the visual experimentation or the energy or the curious sort of ventures that you take actually make sense because you can see them. There's a corollary to them in nature, or there's something that you're
Yeah.
familiar with. So you can see, oh, wow, that's an interesting way to deal with, like for example, in that painting, an interesting way to deal with light.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think,
Whatever.
as when I talk about these things, I'm also in the position of being an explainer, even as a gallerist, and grappling with the obstacles people put in front of their experience of the thing.
Mhm.
And I think a piece like this is really remarkable because you're hit by it so immediately. You're so pulled into this experience, bodily, visually, emotionally. You're in it and you recognize what you're seeing and what you're experiencing. In a certain sense, that's all goes straight into your mind and it satisfies that intellectual core question, almost immediately as you're even experiencing it. And so it can evolve in that way that you're in the place before you know it effectively.
Yeah, like I think for me with that one, which is a motif come I've used and I've been exploring a number of times. But in that particular watercolor, what I get from it is obviously you instantly recognize that it's a sun, but then you're compelled to sort of see behind it or around it, or you want to see what's going on in between. And I
Mhm.
feel like the rays of the sun actually become not an impediment, but it's almost like you're trying to, like,
That's interesting.
oftentimes when something was very bright, you have a hard time seeing it.
Yeah,
And it's like
totally.
there's a struggle or an effort to actually see what's there. And so instead of the light being totally illuminating, in some ways, in this case, the light is becoming obscuring.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because, of course, you're working on these paintings for Stephen Friedman, and there's a painting in there where you have this. There's a kind of screen of um, of branches, but then
Mhm.
the real focus, and this was also in one of your paintings in the Stephen Friedman show in London, is this exact intense light right on the horizon line that you know you're in. Um, yeah. So you have this, yeah, it's interesting because you're talking about, as I hear you saying, it's as if the rays are almost a fence in some way to seeing that sun that you're behind. In the painting that I'm describing, those rays aren't there in the same way. And you really are in there with the feeling that you're almost going past the branches that are around you, if that resonates.
Yeah, well, hopefully when that painting is visible, there'll be another opportunity to talk about it, because that was a huge challenge for me.
Yeah.
This idea of a screen in front of,
Mhm.
like, because it's a very ambient, effusive kind of overall quality with the rays of the light, and to have
Yeah.
something really, really superimposed in front of it,
Yeah.
actually presented like, not conceptually, but technically, it presented a real challenge. But anyway, yeah,
Mhm.
that's for another conversation maybe.
Well, the show is opening September 6th in New York, and if you're there, you'll want to come see that. This is a painting that's titled after Radon.
Mm. Yeah, so this would be an example of, instead of using a photograph, I guess I was using a photograph. I was using a photograph of a painting by Rodin, but I'd actually seen it in person too. Um, but yeah, what I did with this one, and what I've done with many of these, is just make a kind of a reproduction of it really quickly,
Mhm.
like a fast kind of, like maybe spend an hour or something just laying it out, and then I put the Rodin painting away. I
Yeah.
never look at it again.
Yeah,
And
right.
then I just sort of, I have all sort of technical things that I do, like I'll mask off lots of parts of the painting with a like liquid rubber,
Mhm.
just sort of areas that I just want to leave alone, and then I'll cover the whole painting with, say, like black, or
Mhm.
with purple or green or something, or red, and then pull the masking fluid off and see what's there, and then I just sort of build. So yeah, it's these are kind of experiments, and not experiments, they're kind of tech exercises, actually,
Yeah.
in a way. But um but the purpose for me of the exercise is to use a very recognizable, very traditional, conventional sort of motif, and then just to try to have something occur that's not conventional, and not, you know, not necessarily weighted or freighted with history, but feels kind of like you're doing something for the first time, or you're experiencing something very familiar, but you're experiencing it in a new way.
Mhm.
And it's the reason it's an exercise is because it's such a convention. It's hard
Mhm.
to get through the convention.
Yeah,
But
totally.
if you can, it's a little bit like jazz, or a little bit like playing scales. Like, everybody plays the same modal, A minor scale. But
Yeah.
if you can kind of push your way into a new place sometimes, when you accept a convention, like when you
Yeah.
accept something that's really static or very
Yeah.
stable. It's actually a form of freedom, because you can just play with it, and not really worry about inventing a brand new language. But what you're more concerned about is using a kind of a very accepted, kind of like a standard, and
Mhm.
try to do something within that feels new, or feel not new. The word new, I don't care about new, because
Yeah.
sometimes I'll see I saw a pot yesterday from Korea, from the sixth century, and it looked
Yeah.
totally new.
Yeah.
Like, it really looked new. It was new to me.
Yeah.
I'd never seen it
Totally.
before, and it looked
Totally.
completely
Yeah.
fresh and amazing and great. So
Yeah.
it's not so much new. It's but just that it feels alive. It feels like
Yeah.
it's in the present moment. It's not freighted by a kind of, imitation pastiche of the past.
Yeah. Well, I think new is a word that made sense at a certain point when people were inventing new technological mediums and no one had ever made a video before. So I think those kinds of things make sense. And there were also new ways of, say, making a painting. that have come about. But I do think we're in this place where we're dealing with a lot of new things, i.e., artificial intelligence, um, the mass media. I mean, we are absolutely citizens of a consumer society. And if one thinks about what that means, it's opposed to how we deal with the world around us. I mean, that's a big deal as opposed to, say, being someone who's in a natural world. And so those are very new experiences. And it's very interesting, though, that this kind of looking at modernism, looking at various pictorial things, like we're by no means beyond what that's capable of doing for us. And in terms of helping us understand ourselves as individuals in for where we are now, and really helping us have tools to understand how a lot of the things we grapple with are in ways not how we as are not all the ways we as humans can act, or we have a variety of choices to help us see ourselves. I don't know if any of that resonates with you, but that's always on my mind these days.
Yeah, that resonates.
This is a wonderful winter painting, and you want to talk a little bit about it?
Just one technical thing, like I don't know if it's me cutting out or you cutting out, but I am in a hotel, so if for whatever
I'm not
reason
hearing you
I
cut
get
out at
cut off,
all. So if I'm cutting out,
okay,
I don't know.
okay,
The other thing too is that people put stuff in the Q&A, which is awesome, but I'm not actually skilled enough to figure that out. So if there's a chat,
okay.
I think we have a chat feature.
There is a
But
Q&A thing there. Yeah,
yeah,
we'll
I'm
get to
never,
that.
I'm not good enough with it. I would be happy to talk about it, but yeah, okay. Um,
But yeah, this, I don't know if it's a winter piece. Maybe it is. Yeah, this
okay.
is. As you were speaking though, I did. I'll make a confession. I always feel like every artist talk should have something slightly, what's the word, titillating
Yeah,
or
let's
like
do it.
moving in it. But what I was feeling yesterday was that my work was very superficial,
Oh,
and and I was having one of these moments of real kind of like not kind of a doubt, but also not only deeper than a doubt. It was kind of
yeah,
almost like a resignation that I was making sort of superficial things.
yeah,
And the reason that I felt that was because I was trying to reconcile
yeah,
sort of a deeper language, like one that really moves the world, really
yeah,
shakes things up, or is really, tackling these great issues with, like, say, a painting of some flowers or branches or
yeah.
something, or trees, and that dissonance was weighing me down. However, I had a realization that as soon as you leave imagery behind, like as soon as you're like when I was looking around at the Art Institute of Chicago and you see a painting by Frankenthaler, or a
Mhm,
painting by Robert Ryman or something, or whoever, as soon as imagery is gone, and
mhm.
you could accuse that artist of not dealing with certain, whatever pressing
Right.
issues, or not
Yeah.
dealing with identity, or dealing with
Mhm.
something like war or whatever. And I don't think it's fair, because I think, I was looking at this Bryce Martin painting and thinking, on one level, it's just this sort of swooping kind of graduated line.
Yeah.
And you could also accuse that painting of being, in a sense, superficial, but that would
Yeah.
be to totally miss the point. And the point
Sure.
is, just because imagery has been subsumed into something else doesn't mean somehow that the content is also, has dissolved, or is any less meaningful.
Yeah.
So for me, the way I thought about it was, just because I'm using recognizable forms
Right.
doesn't mean my painting isn't, in a sense, kind of abstract painting. And if it's
Exactly.
abstract painting, then the tension or the movement or the energy that enters into it is very similar to what you would see in you know, any abstract painting. And therefore, it's just not fair to put the burden of, a very overt subject matter onto
Yeah.
that reading of the piece. It
Mhm.
just isn't going to help you. And it's not fair for me to do that either, because I'm kind of to myself, because it's like, that's not really what I'm about. So
Yeah.
I do think some artists are both topical and very experimental, and very
Yeah.
free, and I admire that. And then
Yeah.
some artists are really much more focused on a kind of internal feeling, and
Mhm.
energy about things that actually th- these feelings do talk about more than just idiosyncratic personal whims. They do try to reach beyond the immediacy of, you know, branches or flowers
Yeah.
to something else.
Yeah.
But there's also a way that the subject matter isn't really what you're looking at.
Yeah. Yeah. I think those things are true. And I would add to it also, there's also just the anxiety of art making itself, in that you want to communicate something, and there's things you will never know, um,
Mhm.
in terms of how people will respond, or um, and some artists, I think I think that the artist who's really able to kind of acknowledge what they will never know in their own practice, what they'll never know in the interactions with other people. There's so many things you because you'll never get to that point of certainty, but acknowledging that, I mean, that's part of human life. But
Yeah.
acknowledging that and embodying that, I think, is what gives incredible strength to the work, to your work. That's, the experience, an experience that I have. And I think what these discussions you're having do that.
Oh, that's good.
Well, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you might like to talk about? Because we're kind of getting to the end here.
Yeah, getting to the end.
I mean, we have many more works we can look at, but generally we do about
I
half
just
an
seen
hour.
the Q&A really quickly and see if there's
Oh,
anything in there.
excellent. If you can do
How
it, I can't
important
do it.
is emotional engagement in your work, and where is it employed in your work? Uh, Describe your studio practice day to day. Um, well, I think the question about the emotional, like, um, it is about an emotion. Absolutely. It's about a
Yeah.
feeling. And here's the deal. Like sometimes you get big emotions from things like a speech or like a rally or
Mhm.
reading a great work of literature, but I sometimes get great emotions in these really innocuous little moments that like I can be overcome with emotion
Yeah.
from something really small,
Mhm.
or like even sometimes I just see somebody and the way
Yeah.
they're even just their face, like
Uh-huh.
they make me feel so close, like a total stranger makes me feel really close to them,
Yeah.
like they're beautiful, but in like they have like a humility or something that's just like really beautiful. So the point is, I think um the emotional register is very important to me,
Yeah.
and it's sort of like um there is something about when you're a child, how big everything can seem, and then as you get older, it's almost the opposite. It's like how you get so crusty and jaded that everything seems like it's in your purview. It's you dominate everything,
Yeah.
and I want to move away from that. Like I want to get
Absolutely.
back to that place
hundred
where I'm,
percent, 100%. We need like a t-shirt.
yeah,
Yes, 100%.
yeah, just be in a relationship to the world where you're small and you're
Yep.
you're open and
Mhm.
you're really present,
Yep.
because you never actually know where this sort of more grand,
Mhm.
um you're never really aware of when that moment is going to, especially as an artist, you're not in control of when that
No.
moment is or is not going to sort of arrive.
Yeah.
Um, so trying to create conditions in your own day to day,
Yes.
um, I wouldn't say personality. It's deeper than personality. It's sort of like creating conditions in your daily practice or the
Yeah.
way you move through the world that allow you to sort of to be receptive and to
Mhm.
be kind of uh, uh, I don't have the right words, but it's just kind of like being open
Yeah.
to the beauty of where it could come anywhere. Like
Yeah.
it can come from anything, and I think that in a sense, my work is trying to create those, create those kind of opportunities as well. And I also want there to be tension as well. Like for example, the piece that you've got up here, yes,
Yep.
it does look like a field of like flowers, but the middle or like that little where you see it almost like that star.
Mhm.
That's like where someone has walked across the flowers,
Yeah.
like stepped on them. But
Yeah.
instead of crushing them and turning them into, it just makes it look like a star.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
So
you,
it's a simple moment, but there's also a moment where something is kind of being, something is dying or something is being obliterated or crushed, but also it's in that act of it being kind of squished down like that, it actually sort of looks like the sky again, or it kind of looks like a star. And it's a simple play
yeah.
near being really close to something and
Yeah.
being really far away from something.
Yeah. Well, something also that I would point out to people too that they would enjoy is on our website in the press release, there's a lengthy quote that I didn't edit because it's just very clear and fantastic with regard to how you make the works on paper in the studio. And in that quote, you commented that you make something like 50, but your point being that is you make one, if you know where it's going, you then set it aside. And I was so struck, and it's such a profound way to think about making work, that if you know where something's going, you're then going to set it aside. And then you describe yourself cycling through the stack and ranking them and coming back. And then really only through this process of starting and putting away and coming back to things anew and working with a large body of work, then you say, though, at the end, then when you know where a picture is going to go, finally, then you spend a whole day kind of realizing that idea. That just so,
Mhm.
what a wonderful way to think
Well,
about.
Rick Rubin talks about this quite a bit in that new book, the creative act,
Yeah.
which is, everybody talks about it. It's becoming like a cliche, but I will keep talking about it. But
I
he
love to,
talks about there's a really big difference between playing
Mhm.
when you're in the period of playing, you don't know how long that's going to be, and you try not to circumscribe that. But
Yeah.
then there's also a time when it's time to execute. It's time
Yeah.
to finish. It's
Yeah.
time to make something,
Mhm.
and that's a very different set of issues. Like once you know, here's the thing, and I want to see if I can finish this today or
Yeah.
this week.
Yeah.
Your mind and or your being approaches it in a different way, and I like that.
Yeah.
I love it when a painting is at that stage where it's like
Yeah.
I roll up my sleeves and it's like now it's time to get to work and
Yeah.
make something out of this. And it doesn't
Yeah.
always work.
Yeah.
Like there are many times when I get to an end of a process where I'm working on a painting that can sometimes have been going on for months. And I
Yeah.
just take the paper and I tear it into shreds because I'm like,
Yes.
that enough is enough on this one.
Yeah, totally.
I don't want it. I don't want to come back to this again. I did what I could and it didn't work, and it's okay to let it go.
Yeah, it
But
is.
for the most part, I get to this place where now it's time to sit down and really try to it's not even resolve it, but it's try to, okay, now let's give this painting give it what it deserves, the
Yeah.
energy and the time that it deserves, to try to see if I can't. And it's the same with the big ones too. There's a moment where it's like I know what it is, I get it, I get where I'm headed, and in a way, then the real work of trying to make it into an exciting painting begins. There were a couple questions in the Q&A, but one was just about literature, and I
Yeah.
would say just quickly on that, poetry is a big part of my process, but it's never direct. It's always like I'll read poetry, and it's actually helps me understand what I'm doing. Like
Mhm.
it's not that I'm looking for some image in the poem. It's just that the way the poet will describe an experience will sometimes really help me
Yeah.
understand the thing that I'm actually doing already. Like they put
Mhm.
words, they help me. They put words to what is a very internal and very personal experience. But then when you read somebody else articulating in such a powerful way, it helps bolster your sense of kind of meaning. Like, oh, they understand what they're doing with such profundity that it actually sheds light on what I'm doing. So, and often when I'm looking for titles, I'll be reading poems,
Yeah.
trying to see if I can come up with a title. So it's also a kind of an active way of reading poetry because I'll be
Yeah.
looking for certain images that I know,
Yeah.
like certain images that are that they'll be span like someone's career as a poet,
Yeah.
certain like some motif. I'll be reading to sort of find those motifs, but it's a every day basically when I like even in my trip here to Chicago, I brought a book of poetry with me just to it's just kind of like a daily thing for me. Like I think poetry is very, very close to painting.
Yeah,
It doesn't look like painting, it doesn't act like painting, but the core, the essence of it is very, very similar. And
yeah,
it's just a way of framing my thinking.
yeah. Well, of course it is. With poetry and long form, you have opportunities in poetry to have words just not be related to what they mean per se, but what they feel like. They can evoke all kinds of things. And then long form is an opportunity to do something different. Painting is very similar to that play back and forth.
Yeah, and that also the familiarity too of language, like
Mhm.
the way language everybody shares it, but then some people use it with such profound clarity that it changes the way you think about your own use of language.
Yeah. Do you have
But yeah,
moments in
anyway.
pieces like this where you really clearly see your language or see brush marks and then and have that back and forth between what is my brush mark and what is the subject matter?
Yeah, I'm pretty brutal with my work. Like when I'm in the middle of it, like I just think I'm very much like a butcher or something. Like I'm just I'm just like cutting it into
Right.
pieces and trying to make it like there's very little emotion, there's very little
Yeah.
sentiment, there's very
Right.
little even when we talk about poetry and things like that. When I'm in it, it's very kind of brutal. Like I'm trying to make things work. And
Yeah.
I just want it to work
Yeah.
as a thing. It's later on, like in conversations like this, that I look back and I go, oh, what were you
Yeah.
doing? And in this painting, it's quite obvious I was dealing with what is above and what is underneath, and
Yeah.
just trying to make a very simple, a very simple kind of equation or a very simple exploration of you've got some kind of flowering, efflorescing, forms, but then underneath it, there's this swampy kind of watery space. So
Yeah.
that's it. That's what the
Yeah.
whole thing is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, on that note, I think that's it. I mean, you made that point that sometimes you just have to finish something and get it out there. And then, of course, the beauty of making paintings is that you can then go back and look at thoughts crystallized in that way. Um,
Well, yeah, it's just that it's a different thing. Like there's the playing thing that's very important, and people confuse that. They think the playing needs to be execution. Like they think the playing needs to have a result, and it doesn't. The play is play. You're just exploring it. But then when you get to the final stage, it is a different process. It's nice to separate them because we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to always be in this playful place.
yeah.
And you asked me earlier if there's anything I wanted to say that I haven't said yet. And the only thing that I think we didn't really cover that's very important is how important these works on paper are to my
Yeah.
practice.
Yeah.
Everything I do stems from here,
Mhm.
and the way the studio, you know, practice unfolds is I have many, as most people do, many little journals, like little notepads, and I'm constantly writing down little notes and making little sketches and
Yeah.
making little drawings. And I'm also taking lots of photos on my iPhone. So out of 1,000 images, you might get one or two that you
Right.
feel like you want to make a watercolor or a drawing from it. And of the hundreds of watercolors and drawings that I make, I get one or two that I might want to turn into a larger scale painting. So
Yeah.
that process of distillation, and Stanley Whitney talks about this a lot, about you get stuck as an artist, you get lost, and drawing is the way out, drawing is the way through it, drawing is the way to keep yourself constantly in a state of like finding new things and looking for new things. So it's really, really important. And I'm excited that you have embraced showing them as proper works in and of themselves and not just as preparatory works, because so much of what I do as an artist is crystallized and embedded in these works in paper. And I think for me, they're just as valuable, if in some ways, if not more than the other work, because this is where I go to, this is my well, this is the reservoir that I use to,
Yeah.
to keep trying
Well,
to find things. Yeah.
I have a wonderful one here, and I would see anyone who wants to come see Sky's works on paper at the gallery, please do. I think they're materially also something that really is different than your paintings in a lot of ways. I think a lot about Jasper Johns' printmaking, for example, and I think if you're really collecting or informed of Jasper John's work, you really need to really know those pieces and see how his ideas move materially through that medium. He's one of America's greatest printmakers of the second half of the 20th century. And I feel that a lot in your works on paper, that the conversation between them, the way they embody themselves differently, and your wonderful thought on drawing as a way out and a way to reopen ourselves and keep ourselves focused on how to be open and in this process of both playing and coming to conclusions. These are images that did on site in Zermatt in Switzerland. Thanks very much, Sky, for taking the time today and sharing your work with us. It's really a pleasure to work with you. I can't wait for the show that opens September 6th at Stephen Friedman in New York. I hope that people have a chance to go. And if you have any questions about anything that you saw today or want to talk, feel free to send me an email or give me a call. Thanks so much, Sky. Hope you have a great trip to Chicago. Bye.
Thanks, man. Yeah, it's nice seeing you again, Philip.
All right,
Thanks.
take care.